Hey everyone, and welcome back to Digital Doc Interviews. I am here today with my very special guest, Noah Falstein. Noah is a veteran of the games industry. He's been in games for 40 years and has worked as the chief game designer at Google and now has his own consulting company called The Inspiracy that he specifically consults for games for health games and medical startups who are using gaming technology for patient care, for healthcare, for health tech. Noah is someone who I am so happy to know. He has been a great mentor for me, always someone I can turn to advice. And I knew when I started Digital Doc Games, I had to get him on the show to talk about games for health. So with that introduction, what's up, Noah?
Hey, good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on. I had to put my San Francisco background here because the first time we met each other was in the, I'm going to totally ruin myself right now. The Embarcadero, that's what it's called, right?
Close, Embarcadero.
Embarcadero, it's always with the, all right, Embarcadero. We met at the ferry station there at San Francisco, got a nice bagel and a coffee, I think, and talked about video games. And I was still a med student at the time. And what does games for health look like? So I think that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today.
Yeah, technically in that background behind you, the sun is rising over just about the spot that we met, if I have my geography right.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I love it. I love it. It's almost like it was designed. It's just a default Zoom background. Anyway, Noah, I don't want to waste any time. There's so much for us to talk about today. It's hard for me to even think where we want to start, but I think, like I said, you've been a veteran in the games industry for 40 years. I would love to hear a little bit about your journey in the, kind of where you started in the games industry, and at what point during that time of working in the games industry did you start to think of how you wanted to think about games as more than just an entertainment medium? It's a big question, I know.
I was actually just talking to my wife a little while ago about we both had some early experiences with computers in the 1970s, and both had learned how to do punch cards and create these stacks of cards and feed them into this card reader, and it would send the information to usually a computer that was far away because they were still big and was expensive to have a single computer, and how we both hated that. And it wasn't until I went to college that I was first exposed to computer games and immediately fell in love with them. And even then it was just text-based printout games, things like the original Adventure in the Colossal Caverns and some old Star Trek games that would print out text about what you were doing, and you would type in numerical or text commands to respond to it. And I'm lucky enough in that I got involved in games, not even when it was a games industry, but when it was really kind of a hobbyist market with just a tiny handful of companies that were starting to explore, mostly the game companies. So anyway, just to sort of set that aspect, I really was involved in some of the very earliest stages. And at college, I had made a game about mining the asteroid belt, and I did that not because I thought it would help me get a job in games. It never even occurred to me that I could make a living doing that. It was just a fun way to show off the computer programming and physics and astronomy I had learned by making a realistic simulation, but doing it in the form of a game that actually I find is quite reminiscent when I see the TV show The Expanse, based on a series of books. That was the kind of gritty feel I was going for, of being an asteroid miner and being out in a dangerous, void out there. Anyway, to flash forward a lot faster, I spent the first 15 years or so of my career working for companies, most of which I started when they were small and became bigger. I was the 7th employee at what was then Lucasfilm Games and later became LucasArts, now is owned by Disney. I was the 3rd employee at DreamWorks Interactive when DreamWorks was a brand new studio and just starting up their interactive group. That was pretty exciting because I had met Steven Spielberg when I was working at Lucasfilm, and he was very heavily involved with the games we were doing at DreamWorks Interactive in those first couple of
Right.
years.
And what year was
Mhm.
this, Noah?
That would have been 95, 96 when
Okay.
DreamWorks was just starting up.
Gotcha. So
And
games
so,
have already been around for like E.T. already came out and
oh
flopped.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
Okay,
that's the
gotcha.
thing. I mean, starting the context is that in 1980 or so when I started, the Atari VCS was just coming out. Pong was state of the art, and
Right,
that was
right.
the one thing people had heard of. Space Invaders was released right around then, coming in from Japan, and I did arcade games for a while in Chicago. I worked on one called Sinistar that's still a little bit of a cult favorite with some people, one of the early games that used speech. Came to Lucasfilm in '84, and your background picture is taken from Marin County, where I live now and where I came to work for Lucasfilm back then. And I spent 8 years there and really got a lot of their early game systems launched, and worked with an amazing group of people. You know, we all look back at that, and we knew we had something special while it was happening, but we didn't
Right.
realize how unique and special it was to have such a great group of people.
So what was it like really being on the forefront of this new medium? I mean, you were really a pioneer into the medium of video games. I mean, you say working at LucasArts on a team of 7 people. I mean, what was the feeling? What was the air like?
Well, I mean that was a very specific case because the first set of Star Wars movies had just come out. The 3 Indiana Jones movies were in production. I think when I started there, they were just finishing up Temple of Doom. I still somewhere have a very, very ratty denim crew jacket from that. Um, and so we were totally enamored. I mean, pretty much everybody in the company had either been there right at the beginning or been so blown away by those early Star Wars movies that they just felt they had to come work there.
Right.
And so we were incredibly excited. But of course, the video games were this tiny baby brother to the movie side of things. There were several times in the time I was there where we felt that we were on the verge of perhaps being canceled and dismissed, because George came out at one point and said, he addressed the whole company and said, we're making a bit of a change at this point. We've been scattering our focus. We're going to refocus on movies. We're just going to be doing movies, things that support movies. And the group of us that were in games started looking at each other like, is he about to announce this? And then he kept saying, just about movies, and we'll do the post-production and the special effects. And we'll do games too. But it still felt like we were this little afterthought. And around that time, actually, I had been talking to the head of licensing, and we were talking about licensing some of our games and whether we would actually do games based on the Lucasfilm licenses,
Right.
or continue to do brand new creative work as we had been. And he mentioned, I said something about the revenue from games, and he chuckled, and I said, well, what's so funny? He said, well, last year we made more money from Star Wars pajamas than we did from the entire games division. And it really
Yeah.
put us in our place, which wasn't bad, because Star Wars pajamas made a lot of money that year.
Right, right. Oh my God, Star Wars, anything. That's why some people argue that's why the movies are made, to sell pajamas.
Well, there you go. So anyway, we were aware of how cool it was to be there, but we were under no illusion that we were the stars of the show. And if anything, we just kept aspiring to the same level of quality as we saw in the films. And in retrospect, we've talked many times, the group of us that was there at that time, many of us are still good, close friends and see each other quite frequently, and have worked with each other on dozens of different projects over the years. And we realize now that it was a real blessing that we were tasked with doing original titles at first, and not just more Star Wars and Indiana Jones stuff. And it really was a wonderful privilege that it still feels a bit unreal that I got to be involved in something that was so seminal and exciting at the time.
Right, right. And being, in the video game industry for so long, and starting kind of at its roots, you saw the medium grow, right? Were there times that you said, "Hey, there's not only does this medium have some legs, there's some real potential for games outside of traditional entertainment."
Well, it was a very gradual thing for me, certainly. I believed in games, but even I would say 10 or 12 years into all of this, I still was not at all sure of our future. I felt certain that games and interactive entertainment would continue to be a growing area. But I remember in the early 90s, I was having some discussions with some of my colleagues, and some of them were convinced that because the movie industry at that point, and by 95 or so, a lot of the movie studios had established game or other interactive groups. And we thought there was a really good chance we'd just get swallowed up by the movie industry that at that point was still much, much bigger than games. And we thought that they would bring in, there was something called full motion video for a while in the mid 90s, where some of the very earliest CD-ROM based game systems were able to do very poor quality video, but you could actually shoot video with actors and have that incorporated into the games. And one friend of mine, Brian Moriarty, who worked on some games at Lucasfilm and before that at Infocom, he was saying that he thought that the movies would just take over, that it was so much more expensive to hire Harrison Ford. I mean, his budget on one movie, or his salary on one movie, was more than 2 or 3 times our entire budget on a game.
Right.
So of course they weren't going to put us in charge. It would be film directors in charge, and maybe we could be one of those credits far down the list of interactive technology consultant or something. And happily, turned out that games and interactivity are harder than a lot of people thought. And even though Hollywood tried to do that on some level, they just didn't get it. To this day, it's still iffy whether some of the Hollywood people really understand what they're doing when they venture into the interactive side, because it looks very similar when you see it on the screen, but when you are in control as a player, it's a totally different experience than when a director has complete control over what the audience sees.
Right.
And as a consequence, I mean, as far as where things were going, while I was at Lucasfilm, we had a group doing educational games for a while. And that was some of my first exposure to the idea that the games could have a purpose beyond entertainment. But in the mid-90s, after DreamWorks, I went off and founded the Inspiracy and started doing freelance work. And it wasn't until I'd been doing that for a few years that I really started to see the potential for what was gradually being called serious games at the time. And I think the first really obvious step was that I got invited to the Netherlands and the head offices of Shell Oil. And a very visionary guy there realized that the games industry had a lot to offer that he thought that the oil and gas industry could benefit from. So he held a meeting with about 15 or 20 game developers from all around the world, and had us brainstorming and coming up with ways that we could do projects for Shell. And then I think a year or two after that, there was one of the periodic slumps in oil prices, and they cut back on everything speculative. But the seed had been planted at that point, and I was starting to look out for these other projects that went beyond games as entertainment.
I mean, if you can make a video game about oil and gas companies, you can make a game about anything, right?
Yeah, well, it was actually, I mean, it was a fairly practical thing. My first thought was, this is a crazy idea, but for example, one of the things that I think was actually implemented eventually was when you go out onto a North Sea oil platform, it's very hazardous, it's confusing, noisy, close quarters. And at that point, already some of the early first-person shooters, I think Quake at that time had already released a level editor so you could create Quake levels. And he said, well, let's create a level that is a model for an oil platform that's still under construction. And instead of sending people there and having them learn how to get around for the first time on the job, when not only is it physically dangerous, but they're getting, I think, 1.5 or double pay of what they get when they're not on the platform. Let's have them get used to it in the game and have fires break out and you have to grab fire extinguishers and figure out how to put them out. And actually very practical, low-cost way to train people, and training using game simulations, or at least simulation technology, is still a huge thing, certainly in the military, but also in a lot of corporate areas. And the medical stuff started to work in around the same time. I think the company called Hope Lab that did a game called Remission. And I remember our first big brainstorming meeting was 2001, September 12th, because it was the day after the September 11th attacks. And obviously we ended up having to postpone the meeting because everybody was still in complete emotional uproar over that. But that was the first serious game project I worked on. The founder of that company is the wife of the guy who started eBay, and their net worth is in the billions of dollars. So she was funneling a lot of her interest and money into helping kids with medical problems through game-based learning and game-based simulations.
Right.
And
right.
I believe they're still around, but we worked on, they have done several games now, and it was a great experience to be able to do big budget games in an area where most of the stuff was being done with just very small budgets and grants.
Yeah, absolutely. Hope Labs is very, very cool. They are still around. Go check them out. They have some very interesting games, like Noah was saying, dealing with mainly adolescents in mental health or other type of social or even physical medical issues. But they're doing really cool things over there. So Noah, so that's interesting. I didn't know that you worked with Hope Labs. And then, on your LinkedIn bio and, on your social media, you describe yourself as someone working in serious games, specifically in neurogaming and in games for health. So Hope Labs, it sounds like, was one of your first experiences with that type of medical space. What made that catch on for you?
Well, it was a pretty clear, at least in retrospect, clear sequence in that the Hope Lab project got me aware of the potential and also made me, just cognizant of how nice it was to make something that used all the experience I had making entertaining games, but besides just the entertainment, which I think is still significant in itself, also had a really strong medical application. With the Remission Game, it was to help teens who had leukemia and were on chemo. A lot of them, well, a significant number, were not taking their chemotherapy pills because it made them feel sick, and they were teenagers, and even though they knew it was important, a lot of them were just, deciding I'd rather take my chances. I think I'm going to feel fine, and I know I always feel ill for a while after I take my chemo drugs. And so that was more of a sort of psychological combined with, the pharmacological intervention. But the first neurogaming thing I did was right around the same time. There was a company that never really made it called East 3, and they were doing an EEG-based attention training game. And ironically, that was, was very important for me because later, and I'm sure we'll delve into this quite a bit, but I began to work with Dr. Adam Ghazali on a game called NeuroRacer, and that became the company Achille. And that has, finally now, this was 20 years ago that the East 3 company was experimenting with this, so it's been a very slow process. But the potential for video games to tie into neuroscience, it has always been apparent, because as game developers, as game designers in particular, my peers and I have been fascinated with what we're doing as game designers and how that affects the brain, how people interpret the games, and how the interactivity changes their emotions, changes their brain patterns. And of course, as game designers, we knew very little about what was actually going on literally inside their neurons. But we would suddenly find that, or gradually find, I should say, that the neuroscientists were, very much in need of more compelling and interesting ways to run their tests, because they might put together a very simple test and want to collect 20 minutes of data, And after 5 minutes, the people doing it were so bored with hitting a button every time they saw a light come on that the data wasn't very good because they lost interest.
Right,
And
right.
so there's this wonderful synergy between the neuroscientists wanting better testing conditions so that they get better data, and the game developers wanting to know more about what was going on inside people's heads, partly because we were curious, but also to be able to make more effective and more compelling games. And
Right.
so it's always been a really um, gratifying and positive interaction, I find, the more I work with people on the brain science side of things.
That's fascinating. And it's fascinating to hear you talk about that synergy between scientific field of neuroscience and game developers. And through this channel, that's what I'm finding out to be true all over the place across many different industries. So that's really, really interesting. So let's dive into a couple of those neuro gaming companies. You mentioned Achilles, which is just became the first ever video game that received FDA approval to treat an illness. So they have a video game to help treat ADHD in children. Another one that I know that you work with, Noah, is a group called Train Pain, which I think is a very, very cool company that is specifically going after chronic pain and fibromyalgia. And they have a hardware component that is like a wire that you attach to different areas on your body, on your back, that send vibrations while you're playing these games that help you. Hey, there it is.
There you go. Looks just like this.
Wow, that was not planned. That was not planned. So it looks just like that, and you're playing a game while these different stimuli are being sent to you, and in some way being told to focus on some certain vibrations and not other vibrations, which is retraining your brain in your neural pathways and how you respond to pain. And you're doing this while playing a video game. And those are just two that I know that you're involved with. But I guess, I'd love to dive in how you got started with these companies and really what your role with these companies was.
Sure. Well, it varies, of course, from one to another. The Achilles story was probably one of the most interesting in that Dr. Adam Ghazali, who was at that point, I forget his exact title, but he was essentially the head of brain imaging at UCSF. And he had been doing some research with aging brains, and in particular, how as people get older, they have trouble multitasking. And that might come up, for example, as you're driving a car, you're having trouble both paying attention to keeping the car on the road and driving well, but also seeing signs and knowing when your exit was coming up and reading that sort of thing. And he realized that, he was trying to do some testing on how well people could multitask in that situation. And thinking about driving a car, he realized that it might actually work quite well with a video game because there's so many car-based games.
Right.
He had some friends and contacts being at UCSF who actually were former, in one case, still a current Lucasfilm games employee, LucasArts employee. He talked to them about doing this project because a couple of them knew me. They said, oh, somebody we know has actually been working in the serious game field, and he might be a good person to talk to. And Adam and I had a really interesting talk in his office that we still, we go back and remember about how that was really a starting point for both of us in some ways, because he just wasn't sure that doing a game would make sense, and he wanted to pick my brain, as it were, about what had happened with things like Remission and some of these other projects I had worked on. And I similarly was a little skeptical because I've worked sometimes with professionals who want to use games for their purposes, but have very little understanding of what games actually are or what's practical. Frequently, they would look at a game that maybe their child was playing. I remember having one project where someone had a budget of, I think, $20,000. And she said, I'd really, I have heard a lot about this World of Warcraft game. can we do something like World of Warcraft? And yeah, I'd say it was my reaction was the same as yours. And I
Right.
explained to her that just to launch World of Warcraft, they had spent over $100 million, and
Wow.
20,000 wasn't going to get us very far,
Right.
and we had to recalibrate. But Adam happily had both a very practical sense of what games could do and some very clear and I thought extremely feasible ways of applying it. And so we collaborated. I had a relatively small role. That one of the trade-offs of being a freelancer is that I only rarely get to be the lead designer or the main
Sure.
person behind a project, but it means that I get to work on lots of different projects. And I love variety so much. I've been willing to give up, control for breadth of field. So I don't want to oversell this, because my role with Achille has always been coming in, help guide and advise on things, doing some design work, particularly for that early NeuroRacer. And
Right.
now I think my title is executive advisor, and I do some consulting for them and talk about their business plans, but also get involved with the games that they're making. And just about Achille, just to clarify, they're not precisely the first company to do a game with medical applications or even a game that got FDA clearance, but they're the first company where that game is the treatment itself. Every other case before that, the games were connected to cognitive behavioral therapy or physical
Sure.
therapy or something else. And the magical thing about what Endeavor RX, their first commercial game for this, is that it treats ADHD much on the same level as pharmaceuticals do, but just by playing a game.
Wow.
And so instead of some of the really serious side effects you get from things like Adderall or Ritalin, the two most serious side effects noted by people in the FDA study that we did were occasional headaches and frustration. And we thought that was so mild compared to the physical reactions that you can get from a drug, that we were in really good shape there.
Right.
So beyond that, so the train pain guys, it's interesting because they overlap somewhat with Achille in that attention games are very good at commanding our attention. Of course, anybody playing a game will realize that some of the best games, they lose track of time. And the classic, a lot of my friends and I played the game Civilization in its various forms, and you would end up being surprised at, is it time for bed? Well, wait a minute, that's the sun coming up. And I just got so hooked on the game, I totally forgot to go to bed
Oh yeah.
last night.
It's definitely happened to me.
And
I've lost
so
many nights of sleep.
why not turn that ability to totally get your focus and attention, put you in a flow state, and use it in these medical applications as well, for ADHD, for training people to acknowledge the pain they're feeling as a sensation, but not necessarily letting it overwhelm themselves.
Right.
And in that, it's also interesting. My wife, who is a retired psychotherapist and very interested in Vipassana meditation. And another thing that happens here in Marin County is that we have a lot of people interested in meditation and Eastern medicine. And my wife and I felt very much at odds when we first got together about that, because I was very much a hard science, Western medicine kind of guy.
Right.
But what's interesting is that over the years, both as we've grown together as a couple, those two fields have grown together immensely, so that in fact we went to a talk that Adam Ghazali gave a couple of years ago in concert with Jack Kornfield, who was the man that taught my wife about Vipassana meditation. And it turns out that a lot of the Buddhist meditation practices have been completely verified by modern neuroscientists, and many in particular of these pain remediation applications. I also work with a company called Helium that is using VR to help relieve stress and uses similar techniques. A lot of those things have blended the kind of Eastern meditation with Western neuroscience and with video game practices and virtual and augmented reality increasingly as well.
Right. Wow, I mean, it's incredible. Yeah, I mean, I just took one look at your portfolio this morning when I was preparing for the interview, and it's amazing how many companies are out there doing games for health and serious games. But that actually brings me to my next point, which is how do you approach the situation when someone says, "Hey, I'm thinking about, making this game for, this treatment purpose or whatever it is for this pain purpose." Um, like I said, there's so many people doing it, but only, a smaller amount, in my opinion, and we've had conversations like this before as well, but doing it right. And from a game developer point of view, how do you navigate that space, talking to scientists, to startup founders, people who maybe don't know about game development, and try and channel them to, let's not just throw a game at this health problem, let's design a specific solution and let's do it right. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, thanks. That's a great question. Certainly, through trial and error and experience, I've learned how to assess very early on whether this is a person I can work with on that level. And what I would say the most important thing I found that I look for is a level of mutual respect. If somebody is talking about video games as, well, we all know video games are this thing for kids, but I think I can finally make games helpful. And one of the traits that I find that drives me crazy is that I will still get people who think that they are breaking new ground and say, I had this idea of maybe using a game for medical care. And even now, people think that they're the first one. And I say, well, have you looked it up? So, well, no, but I know that nobody's ever done it before because it seemed like such a brilliant idea. And I didn't want to pollute my ideas by seeing what other people have thought about.
Right.
Like, that's just a big red flag to run away, because they're so sure that they're right that they haven't even bothered to see if anybody else has done that sort of thing.
Right.
But beyond that, it's really hard to pin down, because I have worked with people, some of my current clients are doing stuff on a shoestring budget and are just trying to get started. And but we'll have sometimes a really good idea. The trained pain guys, part of what sold me on them was that it was they had such an easy, cogent explanation for what they were doing, that you hook up these two leads, they send little vibration patterns to a part of your body that hurts and a part that doesn't hurt. And they just have, they tell you strap one on your arm where you have pain, and one on your left leg, perhaps, where you feel fine. And in order to play the game correctly, we have a game. As you get immersed in the game, you're getting signals to each of these limbs. And you have to first, it'll tell you, pay attention to your left leg, pay attention to your right arm. And then gradually, as you get better at it, it will start sending signals to both limbs and still tell you which to pay attention to. But now you have to consciously suppress your attention for the one that you don't want to listen to. And because one of those hurts and one doesn't, you're gradually training yourself to voluntarily be able to shift your attention away from that pain and suppress it. And something I only learned very recently, actually reading some books about neuroscience, is that I had always assumed that paying attention to something and ignoring something else seemed obviously to be just two sides of the same coin.
Right.
And it's like one skill, you just shift your attention to something. But I found that, in fact, the studies have shown that it's two separate parts of the brain. You can be really good about focusing attention and still be lousy at ignoring other things. So you can be very distractible. And the paradox there is that you can be deeply interested in something, but you can be distracted and become equally deeply interested in the next thing, and then a few minutes later distracted again. And of course, this fits into things like ADHD, as well as understanding why some people are so good at sticking with a project, or others, for example, may be very stoic and be able to put up with tremendous amounts of pain or distraction, but they don't seem to be very good at focusing in on one thing. They just can ignore other things and maybe be calm and complacent, but not necessarily focused on anything.
Right.
At any rate, it's fascinating as I find these things out. It helps me understand how to design better games that can work these ways. And so to get back to your original question there, when I'm talking to somebody who has an idea, I try to see if it's plausible from what I understand, from what they can explain to me. I will ask questions to see so I can understand as much about the medical side of it as I can. And usually if they're good at explaining it to me, then it gives me a lot of confidence that we can explain it to the rest of the world. And I have a little routine I kind of run in my head of, as they describe what they're trying to do, I do my best to run that as a comparison to various games that have triggered some of the same feelings or evoked some of the same kinds of behaviors. And if there seem to be really good overlaps, then I know that there's a lot of potential.
Right.
Sometimes I've heard with people have great ideas, but they believe that games can do almost anything. Well, for one example, there were some folks that the HIPAA laws, the regulations that you need to go through before you can do medical tests and before you can prescribe things, and the order that you have to contact your patients and all that.
Sure.
It's the bane of doctors everywhere because it's just this huge book of incredibly boring stuff you have to memorize. Mm-hmm. And there was a group that came to me and said, can you help us make this more fun? And games can make things fun, but a lot of games make things fun by purposefully picking a fun topic to begin with.
Sure.
And by picking an incredibly boring topic.
Yeah. How do you make HIPAA fun? That's a tough one.
To their credit, these folks said, well, no, we're not trying to make it fun. We're trying to make it less stultifyingly boring. And I thought that was a good bar. We could probably make it slightly less boring.
Don't set it too high. Right. Well, that's really interesting. So, I mean, two things kind of stand out, or maybe three from what you said. So obviously, one, do your research, do your homework, see what else is out there. This is not necessarily a novel concept anymore, games for health. It's being done, and it's being taken seriously. The other is, think critically about the type of experience that you want or should be making for the problem. And that goes for any type of product that anyone's designing, video games or otherwise. But what is the problem that needs to be solved, and how do you form an experience around that? Now I'm going back because we've had conversations. I've had some ideas I've thrown your way, and I'm like, oh, shoot! He was running that past his.
Hey, but you're one of the good ones. I mean, this is the thing.
I appreciate it.
Well, and I just want to say that people who are actively excited about exploring these possibilities, ultimately that's the final litmus test that this is really something I'm passionate about. It's exciting. The potential for good is out there, but also the potential just to entertain people, and that and I don't like to devalue entertainment. Something that I saw in you that I see in the people I like to work with is that they realize that entertaining is also difficult and worthwhile, and is just as much a discipline as going through med school, although granted a lot less stressful, I think, for the most part. And with all these things, you end up needing people from many different disciplines. It's something I learned at places like Lucasfilm and DreamWorks. Movies have hundreds of people, each experts in their own field, and the greensman who's getting the plants to look just right, and the person doing the lighting, and the person worrying about processing the film are just as important as the directors and the actors and the screenwriters.
Absolutely.
And doing serious games, doing games for health, it's very much like that, because you end up with people from all different areas. I find what's interesting now as we're getting into what's called digital therapeutics is I'm having to learn a lot about areas I'm not all that excited about, like who pays for healthcare and how to get stuff cleared by the FDA, and things that I find fairly dull but are absolutely essential to have people on the team that are excited and passionate about that. Data scientists who want to just do hundreds of comparison studies and extract exactly the information you need. So people who are each passionate but want to cooperate with each other, that's a really good thing to look for.
That's right. So that's really exciting. And you mentioned casual games. One thing that I am in tune to and try to stay aware of when I'm playing games is even the game for entertainment value can have value outside of entertainment. For example, last night I was just streaming playing the first hour of the game Hellblade, which is, yeah, I mean, you know, Hellblade is a game made by a small studio. You play as this Nordic warrior who's, you know, going on a quest, but a huge part of it is the fact that this character has schizophrenia. And they never come out and say that this character has schizophrenia, but she certainly does. I mean, they talked about it in interviews, but she has auditory hallucinations that are very disturbing for her, visual hallucinations, different delusions. And the amazing thing is by playing this game, you as the player get a little bit of a taste of what it actually might be like to have a significant and extremely disturbing psychological disorder. And again, this game was not created to be a digital health tool or to be an education tool, but as so many games do, you as the player, by playing this, are given the opportunity to walk a mile or so in this character's shoes and understand the perspective of somebody else. So one thing that I'm really interested in that you touched on is how can even just normal AAA blockbuster video games teach us about health, ourselves, other people. It's a very interesting medium to explore.
Well, at the Game Developers Conference, that's has been the one big gathering spot, you know, every year for, you know, the entire games industry. And the last year was held in person, and hopefully not forever. There was a wonderful talk I went to about exactly what you bring up. There's a doctor, she gave a talk about, she listed half a dozen games that are, including Hellblade, that are exactly, as you say, really good realistic depictions of various types of mental disorders and illness. And one of the ones I remember in particular showed a little clip from a different game that was dealing with a character in the game has anxiety attacks. And in order to play the game well, there's a critical point where you actually have to help talk that other character through, you know, talk them down from their anxiety attack. And she was pointing out how it both did not stigmatize this player at all for being somebody with you know, prone to anxiety, but even better, it through the play of the game taught you valuable techniques that you could use with anybody having a real anxiety attack. Right. And didn't do it by beating you over the head with it. It was actually part of the fun of the game to do it well. So we're starting to see some of that. It's still tends to be the smaller indie games that really dive into these things fully. But there's a company called Embodied Labs. A woman named Carrie Shaw is in charge of that. She's been using virtual reality to have caregivers simulate the problems that some of their patients are undergoing. The first one was dealing with macular degeneration. And so in her VR system, you put on the VR headset and you basically have dinner at a dinner party, but there's a big black blotch in the front of your vision. And because it's VR, no matter where you look, this always follows you. And so you have to learn to somehow catch things out of the corner of your eye and have other people help you with, you know, cutting your food and that sort of thing. And she had said she found that it worked really well, and that a lot of times there might be a 25-year-old caregiver caring for somebody much older, and they have very little patience for this person who just keeps knocking things over. They do this simulation, and suddenly it was this night and day thing where they said, oh, suddenly I get it, and I'm not frustrated anymore. I realize how difficult it is. And she now, I think, has half a dozen or so different types of simulations running a whole range of different problems. And I find that really fascinating as a great creative approach, that they're not certainly games or even all that game-like, but creating an accurate simulation using a VR headset. Usually the only people who know how to do that are game developers. So there's a lot of overlap, you know, on the technical side. Or another company that actually is also raised several tens of millions of dollars and was recently bought out by a German company, is Level X, a Chicago-based company that's also one of the
Eric from
handful.
Level X was our first interview on the channel.
Very good, yes. And Level X, as I say, is another one of those companies like we talked about who gets both parts right. They care equally about the medicine and the quality of the video games. And it seems like a no-brainer, but it's surprisingly rare to find a company that is willing to not just pay lip service, but to actually put their investment and their time into doing both aspects of that very well.
Right, right. And, you know, I think if anyone is watching along who is an aspiring game developer, someone who wants to get in the games industry, as so many people do, take this lesson that there's so many ways now in 2020 to get in, it sounds like. Doesn't mean you have to be working for, you know, Activision or Bungie or Naughty Dogs or some of the greatest studios. I mean, that'd be great if that's where you can get to, but there are all these smaller players or different players, not necessarily in the entertainment area, that are needing video game developers, because those are the people we need. These are the people who can make these experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great summary.
Yeah, yeah. A good question I want to make sure to ask you. I know at this GDC, which was virtual, it was my first GDC I could attend because of that. You gave a talk called Games for Health in 2020, and what the landscape looks like in 2020. I think we've touched on a lot of that today. It sounds like 2020 versus 2010, it's a whole different ballgame with Games for Health. There are players in the field who are building these health solutions with video games and video game technology. So my next question for you is, in 10 years, when you're giving the talk at GDC, the Games for Health, hashtag Games for Health in 2030, what would you say that looks like?
Well, you know, I'll start by saying at first, when I had proposed this talk for GDC, it was in, I think, October or November last year. They get this stuff running very early. And I said, I'll do a wrap up and talk about, particularly just over the last year, interesting developments that have happened in the year before GDC. And of course, none of us knew at that point that the health landscape was going to be totally dominated by this pandemic. So I just bring it up. I ended up in the talk. I spent most of my time, in fact, itemizing the many ways that the games industry had jumped in and had already, in just a matter of months, because it wasn't held in March, but rather just in August. So just in the last few months had created many games or modifications to games to deal specifically with the COVID-19 crisis. And it's I think a great lesson that when you look to the future, you just have to be ready to be surprised.
That's right.
And you were asking me before whether I kind of knew that or believed that the games industry would get to its current state back, 30, 40 years ago. And I have, in fact, learned to kind of go with the flow, that I know I'll be surprised by where things go. I know that the new technologies will cause us to constantly reinvent things. Social and cultural influences are, enormously important, and that changes the way that we work both creatively and the kinds of projects we focus on. So, for example, some of the work that I've done, I'd actually love to do more, involves autism, and people's awareness of autism has just skyrocketed in recent years. So, looking ahead in 10 years, there are a couple easy predictions. I would say some of the things that I'm seeing develop now that I'm completely convinced of, certainly digital therapeutics and the idea of using games and or game technology to directly treat things, to
Right.
diagnose is another thing we haven't talked about, but games often are quite good at diagnosing changes in someone's neurological condition. And it's quite possible that you'll have a switch in a game saying, are you interested in having us evaluate your gameplay and look for signs of incipient Alzheimer's or Parkinson's? And it's a scary choice, and I hope that it will be a choice people will have to opt into, but we're already learning how to do that sort of thing.
Right.
And in many cases, it may mean that people will be able to catch degenerative diseases 5 or 10 years before they're able to, previously. So I think we'll be seeing a lot more of that. Companies like Level X that do training for physicians, that's another sweet spot that, we've joked about the fact. I remember actually watching the TV show Scrubs and getting the distinct impression that part of every doctor's residency at this point involves playing many hours of video games. And I think we'll be seeing more and more of integration of games and training, particularly using things like VR and AR and integrating teams, so that if you're in an operating room or in an emergency room, having that ways to practice and hone your teamwork with a bunch of other people, and to be able to do that in a way where you can afford to fail spectacularly with no consequences to real patients.
Right.
But every game player knows that the only way to get good at a game is to fail over and over again until you really learn to master whatever it is the game's teaching you.
That's right.
And so many times in education and medical training, there's more of an attitude of, no, you have to do it just this way. Don't deviate at all because we can't afford any mistakes. And that was true if the mistake meant that you harmed or even killed somebody. But if it's virtual patients, it's wonderful to be able to have that range of making mistakes. So
Yeah.
I think we'll see more and more of that, where these game techniques are used to allow people to train themselves. And it may also mean that, we're already starting to see it, these serious training aids that you can get continuing medical education credits for by playing games that are fun but also teach you something important. The flip side of that is that consumer versions of those exact same games will be a great way that a 14-year-old can realize, wow, this whole bit of analyzing x-rays is fascinating.
Yep.
I think I want to become a radiologist. And by the time they're actually ready for med school, they may be incredibly adept at a whole range of tools because they've used the simulations of them already. So I think we'll see all of those things.
Absolutely. I love that future, and I totally agree that that's where we're headed. I'm so glad you brought up that last point of expanding the market, and on a business sense, but also on a practical sense of that you can make these things for doctors, for patients, but you can also put it out in the wild and anyone can give it a shot. And that I was actually trying to think of a way, because I wanted to talk about that exact concept. So I'm glad you brought it up. But yeah, I mean, why not allow a 14-year-old, girl who's in high school, or a 14-year-old guy who's in high school to try to do a surgery in the OR and see if that's something that might be interesting for them. I think that's, I've thought a lot about how there's all these doctor TV shows, Grey's Anatomy, House, ER, all these
Sure.
New Amsterdam, all the new ones. And that's, more and more just pop up because people like them. I think certainly you could do a similar thing with video games, and there's a lot of interesting stories and interesting perspectives to teach.
Well, as people, and this is something I've learned from the entertainment side of things, we're naturally drawn to stories about conflict, about life and death. And that's why you get not only the doctor shows, but the cop shows and the military stuff out there. And certainly police and absolutely military has been, done over and over again in video games. There are not a whole lot of games about being a doctor. It's more complex to do well. And if you really want to simulate it, you need to have a lot of expertise there. But yeah, I do think we're going to see more games where, and there have been a handful out there, but they tend to be almost sort of magical in that you for example, will get, you get, was it healing points or something? And then if an operation's going very poorly, you can spend those points to heal somebody. We're probably going to need to get a little more realistic than that if we're going to want to make it work. But the military simulation games, or even Microsoft's Flight Simulator that's out there now, are incredibly realistic. And we're starting to learn how to get the same level of realism into, a thoracic surgery game, or even, some sort of brain surgery. And it'd be fascinating to be able to see how we can bring those to the next level.
Yeah, and who knows? I mean, Flight Simulator has proven that people don't mind spending hours in real time going from LaGuardia to LAX. You know, they're down to actually do the whole flight as it would actually be. So who's to say people don't want to do a 8-hour surgery? You can make it realistic. Yeah, my wife and I, there was one patient in medical school that I had who, it was like that one story I always go back to. It was a young teenage girl who got in a tragic car accident and needed a serious emergency surgery. And I was with her when she first arrived into the emergency room, and I was with her in the OR, and I was with her in recovery, and I was with her over the course of the week. And eventually she died. And it was the one patient that really stuck with me. I think just because I saw her from awake to not living. And my wife and I made it through a couple pages of a Google Doc, writing a script and a game design and a level designs for how we would want to make a game, a story inspired by this girl, and turn it into something. And you know, kind of life came and interrupted us, and we haven't gone back to it. But you know, maybe I'll take a look at the old Google Docs and see.
Yeah. Don't let that go away. I mean, another thing I found over the years, in fact, even as we're talking, I've got piles of stuff I just took out of a box in the garage that has, you know, some of the concept docs I did 35 years ago for Lucasfilm. This one is a multiplayer Star Wars game proposal from 1987.
Oh my God, no way.
And one of the things I found is that you hold on to all that stuff because there's always some way of using it. You know, even if not the whole concept you have, some of the best features from it may suddenly pop up, and it may be another 10 or 20 years from now. So make sure you hold on to that doc. I mean, luckily now it's all in the cloud. You don't have to have boxes in your garage. So
right, that's great that you have that. I'm very curious what's in that side that document.
Oh, I've been prompted by some stuff on Twitter today, and I thought, oh yeah, I really haven't opened that box in years, and it's like, yeah, I should actually, you know, digitize some of this stuff and put it.
Yeah, that's history right there. Oh my God, for sure. Let me know if you end up doing that. Okay. Noah, thank you so much. I personally have learned so much. It is always a pleasure to talk to you. Again, I have to apologize. I was saying to you before we started recording, I usually have my notes and my questions and everything. This is my first day back from paternity leave, and I can feel, I have my third cup of coffee here, and I could feel my new youngest son getting to me. So.
Okay. Well, you hide it very well, and I wish you the best of this second round of fatherhood for you.
No, it's going great so far. There's nothing better than seeing those two kids playing together. So
marvelous.
Awesome. Well, Noah, thanks so much. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Please remember to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'm just starting to realize that when all the YouTube channels I watch say like and subscribe. Oh no, it's good to like and subscribe. So do that, and we'll be back next week with some more cool stuff. Thanks everyone, and game on.